In this video, we're going to be talking about the cell cycle and mitosis. Mitosis refers to one way that cells replicate or reproduce. So this is actually a type of cell reproduction. And it's a form of asexual reproduction. So in this case, it's kind of like cloning, where one cell basically divides into two identical cells. Now, mitosis is just one stage of the cell cycle. So the cell cycle is kind of like the life cycle of the cell. And during this life cycle, the cell is going to grow and potentially reproduce through mitosis. So first of all, we need to talk about why cells need to be able to divide in the first place. Well, all sexually reproducing organisms, including humans, start out as a single fertilized egg. So essentially, we start out with an egg plus a sperm that combine to form something called a zygote. So we've got an egg, sperm, forming a zygote. So we all start out as a single cell, but as we grow, we ultimately are made up of trillions of cells. So how do we get from one cell to trillions of cells? Well, that happens through mitosis. So this one cell then goes through mitosis to form two cells. Two cells go through mitosis to form four cells. Four cells form 8 cells. 8 cells divide to form 16, etc., until we ultimately end up with a human made up of trillions of cells. So cells need to be able to divide, and by divide we mean reproduce, so make new cells, so reproduce or replicate themselves, so that we can grow from one cell to trillions of cells, and we develop. Because remember, we look a lot different than we do when we're first born. And during embryonic development, we're just clumps of cells like we see here. Also, once we're full grown and we have all the cells we need in order to be a functioning human, we still have to repair and replace cells, because cells are living things, and so cells are created, but they also can die. So over time, our cells are just being replaced by new cells. In addition to that, if we get injured, we have to be able to make new cells in order to fill in the damaged or replace the damaged cells. Now, before we get too much further into the cell cycle and mitosis, I want to go back and review some of the cellular structures that you've learned earlier in the semester, because these structures are going to come up again as we talk about the cell cycle and mitosis. So first of all, just as a reminder, all cells are surrounded by a cell membrane, which is also known as the plasma membrane. And so this cell membrane is kind of like the skin of the cell. It creates the boundary between the external environment and the internal environment. And that's the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the majority of that cell membrane. The cytoplasm is kind of the goo inside the cell. So it's basically this whole area between the outside of the nucleus and the inside of the cell membrane. So this whole area is the cytoplasmic region. And this is where the intracellular fluid is, which is also called the cytosol. And this is where we also find the organelles suspended in the cell. So things like the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, and the mitochondria are all suspended in this goo-like substance inside the cell. You also learned about different organelles, which are structures in the cell that carry out a specific function for the cell. And we're not going to go over the specifics as to what each of these organelles does here. So just a reminder that these exist inside the cell, because when a cell replicates itself, it has to make a copy of those organelles and make sure that each new cell that's created during the process also gets some mitochondria and ribosomes and endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus, etc. Recall that cells also have an internal skeleton made up of fibrous proteins called the cytoskeleton. And these fibrous proteins help to give the cell structure and allow for movement. And when it comes to cell division, they're actually going to help to essentially cut the cell in half as well. One structure that we probably haven't talked about much in the class, but is going to play a really significant role in mitosis, are going to be these things called centrioles. And centrioles, as you can see here, are these kind of unique shaped structures here. And they have these kind of protein fibers coming off of them. So they actually have some of these it's kind of cytoskeleton, it's the microtubule fibers that actually are attached to them. And we're going to talk about why they are so important when we start talking about mitosis. So just kind of remember what these are when we talk about them again a little bit later in the video. Recall also that eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. So remember that this is only for eukaryotic cells. And the nucleus is this kind of big structure that we see here. And inside the nucleus is where the DNA is. And this DNA is packaged in these structures called chromosomes. So in eukaryotes, chromosomes are these bar-shaped structures, but sometimes they look like the letter X. And we'll talk about the difference between those two types of chromosomes a little bit later. Also remember that the nucleus has its own membrane, which is a double phospholipid bilayer. So it's kind of similar in structure to the cell membrane, but it does have some differences to it. But this is really important because remember, those chromosomes are basically stuck inside the nucleus. So you can imagine that when it's time to move those chromosomes around, which is something we have to do during mitosis, we actually have to get rid of that nuclear membrane, at least temporarily, so that we can separate those chromosomes from each other.